Welcome everybody again to our Q4 webinar here. We're going to talk about the FDA's just issued guidance, uh, and you see the final in quotes here. And Steve will lead us through and talk about the highlights of that computer software assurance guidance. And this, as we go through, if you have questions, please again put those in the Q&A portion. It should be a bottom button right at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer those as we go along. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Obviously, this is a topic of interest because we've gotten more registrations for this than we have for any other webinar. Not everybody's on yet, but there was obviously great interest. Um, One of the things I want to point out, if you've attended any of our quarterly webinars before, we do them in a lot of different ways. Like if you were in the one from last quarter, we were talking about careers. There were no slides at all. It was all just conversational. This one's a little more technical in content, so it is more presentation oriented. But as Mark mentioned, we want to see your questions throughout. So please use the Q&A because it's always better to answer a question at the time when we're talking about the topic. Than, I mean, obviously we'll take questions at the end as well, but we like to see what pops up as we're talking because we can address it right away and adjust the delivery. We can certainly do that.
And about that content, Steve, just remind everybody that we will post this to our YouTube channel so you can see
Yep.
the full recording as you go through it. That does allow you to review the slides as you go along. So that's the way the content will be handled after.
Yeah. And if you've not been to our YouTube channel, you should just look up QRx when you're on YouTube. And all of our webinars and lots of other presentations we've done are available there. Just a quick background. Whoops, I got to get on the right screen here if I want it to progress. There we go. A little bit of background about me. I've been in the industry for over 30 years in MedTech, and that was after 7 years in the computer systems industry. And you'll see this on Mark's slide as well. We both teach at St. Cloud State University in their master's program on MedTech quality. By education, I'm supposed to be a mechanical engineer, something I never actually did in my career. So that was always interesting. It was good brain training. Somebody asked me about that the other day, and I said, "So why'd you do it?" I said, "Because it was good brain training." And a variety of certifications through all my years of experience. But my contact info is there as well as my LinkedIn profile. Always happy to connect with people or take questions afterwards as well. And then Mark,
Yeah.
also quite a bit of experience. Okay, you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm not quite as long toothed as Steve here, just a bit over 25 years in kind of all the areas of regulatory and quality. As Steve mentioned, we got the St. Cloud State stuff there, um, and my BS comes in electrical engineering. So we have that again, the technical background as well as my MBA that I have there, and several certs from ASQ and our involvement in ASQ. I'm currently the chair of the Minnesota chapter. Steve is the chair-elect coming after me. And next year, I move up to be the regional director for the West North Central region of ASQ. And so we'll continue our involvement with ASQ and continue to deliver content as much as we can at the various conferences. So go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, great. All right. So just quick to set the stage for this. Um, Obviously in 45 minutes, we're not doing a deep dive. This isn't going to be a how-to necessarily, to implement this, but we wanted to go over kind of the key elements of the guidance, and particularly since there was quite an update from the original version to this one. This is why it's become a hot button for me, is because I think, let's talk about it and you'll see the differences as we go here. Um, just to clarify, right, this is not for your software as a medical device or your software in a medical device. There are other guidance documents that talk about how to handle submissions when your device includes software, is software, portable apps and things like that. This is for all the software used to manage the quality system, including production. processes, right? So those clauses in the current 820 around, automated systems, and that's in 1345 as well. So it's pretty broad, but it is, again, a lot of companies just refer to it as our non-product software, which I think is a good way to think of it. But you can see in the list of examples, if you're using EQMS software, that most of definitely falls under, this guidance. Factory automation systems, a lot of your data collection or SPC systems could definitely fall under theirs. And I said could, right? And it's not a guarantee. Data analysis software, potentially. Product lifecycle management, product data management systems, almost definitely, fit as part of your quality system. And then ERP, and we'll talk more about that one because that one does get missed as people think, well, that's just a business management system. But there are elements usually in your ERP that become part of your required record keeping from a regulatory perspective. And so, therefore, parts of your ERP system could definitely need application of this guidance. There. Continuing on this theme, this to me is the most important part of this. And I think it's what makes this a really good guidance from the FDA is it's framing a risk-based approach because, for anybody who's familiar with the old, software, life cycle guidance, for validation that most people were trying to use because it had one section at the end to talk about non-product software. And it was always like, well, how much validation, right? It got really confusing to try to figure that out. And this one answers that question going, well, yeah, FDA allows you to scale that approach like it does with everything, or at least that 1345 does. So that risk-based thinking is definitely meant to be part of this. And I think that's what makes this a really valuable guidance document is it finally gives you a way to scale this, to not overdo it and not to underdo it. Because those are the two ends of the spectrum that we usually see when we're talking to our clients and doing audits and those kind of things. Is either it's not done well at all, or it's just a one size fits all, and you're way over validating certain
And this
systems.
clearly, while it's not directly referencing QMSR, it's getting us ready for QMSR, right? That alignment with
Yeah,
1345.
that's a good point. And I'm going to talk about that in a second as well. But it gives you this sort of spectrum, right? Where it's always possible you could rationalize the need for no validation, right? This system does not fall, within the scope of the guidance, or to do a lighter validation or a full validation, right? So it does give you quite a bit of power to really determine, how much effort needs to go into this. Just some history. The original draft of this was put out in September of 2022. It was in pretty good shape at that point, and so a lot of people did implement it. But a lot of people, I think, just sat there and waited, were waiting for this final version. And then it was finalized just this last September. And notice I put finalized in in quotes, because it is not actually the final version. And they actually allude to that in the footnotes on page 2 because of the timing, it came out now, which means it is written relative to the current version of 820, the QS reg. Okay, we all know that, right, a new version of 820, the QMSR, goes into effect in just 52 days. Okay. And so in the footnote, they've acknowledged that all of the references in the guidance now are to the existing 820, and they are going to issue another version of this guidance. They didn't say when. They just said, that there will be an update to this based on the updated 820. I would expect that what they're saying is, and they kind of allude to this, they're going to replace those 820 references to the corresponding 1345, right? And I give an example there where the current guidance references 820.70i, which is about automated processes. That's equivalent to 1345 sections 416 and 756. So I think that's what the next version will look like. I don't think they're going to suddenly add different requirements or change their thinking on things. It's just they're going to clarify all those that they're going to make it align better. But be aware there will be another version coming. All right. So some interesting things that happened, with the final version versus the draft. Is this I call the keeping up with the real world? In the original draft, they didn't really talk about cloud-based applications. And now they're recognizing that, right? And they recognize that, yeah, that's pretty much how a lot of applications are delivered these days. And so they include that and say, yeah, we understand that. And that means it's still within scope. It's still software that you use to meet the requirements of your QMS, regulations and your production controls. And so the fact that it's delivered in a cloud-based model, and they give examples of, how that might be delivered, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or just the software as a service. And they're saying all of those potentially, come under the scope of this guidance. So one, I think that's a good recognition. I don't think I've seen anybody try to use it as an excuse. Oh, we don't need to validate this because it's not really our software. It's just out on the cloud. But I could see where that logic could be attempted. Don't do it is really the answer there. And so that's the answer, right? Is they're basically telling us, look, this guidance applies regardless of how your software gets implemented. If the software, and I'll talk in a second about intended use, meets the requirements for applying this guidance, then they don't really care how you're getting access to that software.
And and this really makes sense, right, Steve? That,
Yeah.
wouldn't you want to know that the software actually does what it's supposed to do when you're using it? Not
Yeah,
that
well,
you're
it's
just
it's
kind of
it's
guessing
like
or
yeah.
hoping that it does, but you actually have some information that says that it actually does.
Yeah, it's like I do in a lot of my webinars and seminars. I always say, forget there's an FDA. You have to run a business effectively. You're going to invest a lot of money in software. Don't you want to know that it works?
Right.
Right? All of this, every regulation has an actual business value to it, right? It's not it's a burden that we have to go through because we're regulated and it's, I guess we have to do this. No, you want to do these things, right? The FDA is just, and every regulatory body is just simply reminding you these are the things you absolutely need to consider. But it's not because they made them up, it's because you should be doing this anyway. So let's just make sure you do it right. And so the same thing applies here. So, I mentioned that it comes down to really the intended use of the software as opposed to how you're implementing the software. And the basic question comes down, and this is in the guidance, right? Is are you using this software to manage production or managing your QMS? Pretty broad questions, but it's to give that differentiation between your accounting software doesn't count, right? That kind of thing. If you've got any, executive level systems, they probably don't fall under this. But if you're doing it to manage production, production controls is part of your QMS, therefore it's in scope, and the QMS as a whole, right? Anything you're using to manage your aspects of your QMS
Be,
would certainly fall
Yeah,
in
before we
line.
completely dive into this, Steve, too, intended use, obviously, for us that operate in the medical device world, intended use often brings just that connection to our product into being. There's actually a note right in the guidance that this wording intended use is different than the product intended use or medical device intended use that's in 801.
Right.
And so just want to be clear about that, that we're talking about the use of the software that you're talking about here. Um, and because that intended use words have such good meaning for us, I think it actually helps us understand, what am I going to use this for? Um,
Yeah, it's funny how often I do that when I'm doing audits and I'll ask about, okay, how'd you validate the system? And I'll ask a question. So where did you document what you wanted the system to do? You often get this kind of surprised look like, what? Well, what are you using this for? Right? Because a lot of times, especially like you buy an EQMS or an ERP, it can do a lot of things.
right.
Did you nail down which of those things you're going to do and how you're going to apply them? And that's sort of the basis for this, is that you do have to say, this is what I want this software to do.
And we'll mention that a couple of times as we go through here because that's a very important piece to understand the scope of your validation.
Yep, exactly. This is an interesting element to the guidance as well, is the differentiation between direct use of the software and supporting use of the software. Right. So direct use is automation software, right, on your production line. Supporting use is I gather some data about that process and then I analyze it. Um, the fact that it's supporting and not directly involved doesn't exclude its applicability, the applicability of this guidance. However, you could use that as part of your rationale for why that's lower risk, right? If that software just provides a supporting role rather than a direct kind of control role, then obviously the risks would be different, and right, and they acknowledge in the guidance that that probably means it's a lower risk, which would then later imply that you could do a lighter version of the validation and assurance activities. As I already alluded to, general business operations or infrastructure software are not within scope, right? So your accounting system, your networks in general, right? They're saying, look, you're not required to validate your networks. I remember when Part 11 came out, and it was all this stuff going, we have to validate our networks now, and we have to apply all these rules to Microsoft Office. I was like, no, no, those are sort of platforms and infrastructure, and that's not what they're intending at all. It comes down to the functions, right? Again, to that intended use. And if your system does a lot of different things and it's a mix, you only have to validate or perform assurance activities on the functions that are applicable back to the first bullet, right? Does it control production or is it managing part of my QMS? So, an ERP system I used before is a good example, right? ERP systems do a bunch of different things for your business, hence the word enterprise in the E. But some of it is not within scope of this, but other stuff, right? You're going, well, it maintains our ID and traceability capabilities. Okay, well, that's a regulatory requirement. That part of the ERP is going to require some degree of validation,
Right.
right? But
But
other aspects
the
of it,
cost of the part is not part of your quality management system.
right? Yeah,
As
that's a good
much
one,
as it
right? If you're
comes
doing
in,
costing,
costing
analysis,
doesn't
yeah.
apply.
Yeah, that's not part of it there. So again, you do get to scale it because I know that question has come up and people are just going, "Oh man, how do I validate all of SAP?" You're not required to, and this gives you that guidance on how to make those decisions.
And I think, Steve, that question that you asked, does it help meet a requirement of the regulations? Does it help meet the requirements of ISO 13485 standard? If that is a yes, then that means it's in scope. If it's a no, then it's likely not in scope, right?
Right. Yeah, and then there's some subtle area. I think you just kind of allowed for. There is some gray area in there, but yeah, if it's something that's required by regulation and your system is now managing that, the answer is yes, and you're going to have to think about this guidance. And as I mentioned, right, the idea was to create this framework based on risk. And so some of the other things to consider, you do have to consider the device, right? And the ability for your systems to impact the performance of your device, right? So device risks have to be identified. Could your system in some way lead to a device that can't perform or doesn't perform as specified? If the answer there is yes, they've said basically this is an automatic do not pass go. This is your highest risk type of system. And you're going to have to do full validation on that kind of system. And we'll talk about the types of validation and assurance activities a little bit later on this. The other side is just process risks, right? Because, okay, so what's the risk to the process? Could it stop production, right? Could it slow down production? Could we lose some data inadvertently, right? And all of those have different risk levels. So, when you're looking at the process risks, you've got everything from no risk to low risk to high risk, right? Um, and what they want you to think about is, right, things like severity. How bad would it be if that happened, and how likely is to happen? And hopefully that sounds really familiar, that they didn't invent a new concept here. And if you're not getting it, it's a reference back to ISO 14971, that those kind of concepts are alive within this guidance document as well. Data integrity should go without saying, and unfortunately, too many companies don't pay attention to it. If you read the warning letters, FDA will ask you about that, and they're going to look for how are you managing and protecting the data. If that's your record, that shows compliance to the regulations and that you know what you're doing. So that's you need to look at, is there a data integrity risk, because that could escalate the amount of validation required. Cybersecurity should be forefront on everybody's mind, hopefully, right? That could somebody mess with your system, right? That's not supposed to. And That's both, you know, connected systems should be considered here, but also for me, cybersecurity should include the ability for somebody to walk up to a system and somehow change it, right? That's an element of cybersecurity. So you need to be thinking about, yeah, how are we protecting the system from, unintentional changes or, you know, undermining what it does. And they do use this terminology as well in the guidance that they expect you to look at what's reasonably foreseeable, right? So you do need to think broadly, not just think happy path. This is the only thing that could happen, right? That'll never happen. Well, if it's reasonably foreseeable that there could be a power surge and somehow that could affect the system in these ways, then you're supposed to, address that. And again, this should sound familiar as a concept, mentioned in ISO 14971, right? So there's always that connection between the other regulations and standards that they're allowing for here. Just taking a quick
One of the
look.
things that
Yeah.
Karen had brought up here, Steve, is some of the commonalities. When she happened to mention Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX
Hmm.
requirements, but you can talk about SOC 2 or these other cybersecurity steps that you would take to validate, um, that the software is doing what it's supposed to do. Is very common terminology is being used within the guidance document. They're trying to make connections to other things that you might validate, even though they might not technically be in the scope of this. You could have a common procedure that covers software validation wherever you use the software. Again, from a business standpoint, you want to make sure that your software is doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
And so there might be some commonalities that you can leverage here.
Yeah, I think that's good. I hope nobody walked away from my previous comments going, "Oh, good, we don't have to validate our accounting systems." No, no, no. One, business value would say yes, you should. And things like SOX might tell you you're going to have to, right? Because you have other regulations and standards your business has to comply with besides the ones we're talking about today from the FDA. But to your point, yeah, validation concepts are pretty similar. So if you're going to have a procedure on how to validate systems, you might want to extend it past just what the FDA requires because the methods are probably going to be the same and will probably be just as welcomed by your SOX auditor as it would an FDA inspector.
Yep.
All right, this is an interesting one. Effect on regulatory submissions. So particularly where you're doing it in a production environment, right? You're essentially when you change the software, you could be you're basically making a manufacturing change, right? And so the guidance mentions, particularly around PMAs and HDEs, so that's pre-market authorizations and humanitarian device exemptions, that the changes you make to software over time could require you to send in a supplement, a 30-day notice, to update, hey, we've found that, yeah, this software change has the potential to affect the device's safety or effectiveness. Therefore, we're making FDA aware of the fact that we're making this change. And right. And then here's what we did to validate that and mitigate the risks, all of that kind of stuff. So just remember that it's not independent of the device. And that goes back to the previous slide where we said you do need to consider device risks so that you understand, right? That is sort of established initially, does this software have any ability to create device risk? And now, if we have certain types of, submissions, do changes then, you know, imply that we need to do some sort of notification back to the regulatory bodies? Even if you say, look, it can't, right? If you have a device, you're building a device that's, there on a PMA or an HDE, you are creating annual reports, you would still capture it as part of those annual reports, right? So you don't need to do a 30-day notice, but you still need to make note of the fact that you made these changes, and here's how you know that that was okay. So again, just the key is they're reminding you, right? There's a connection here to the submissions that you've done. And just before we started, Mark and I had an interesting conversation. They don't mention things like 510Ks, but I think this needs to be a broader consideration based on that, right? Because again, we all know, right? If you make a significant manufacturing change, you could need to do, right, a new 510(k). Um, and so I think this comes into play as well.
And with that, then one of your things you might put in this plan is that quick evaluation. Does this affect product?
Yeah, right. And then, yeah, if so, then yes, we need to look at the impacts to our submissions and not just PMAs and HDEs. All right, so what does this all mean when we say you can scale the type of activities needed to validate a system? So there's unscripted testing. So if you can say, look, there's pretty minimal, chance for risk, but there's no device risk possibility, and process risks are pretty low, or moderate or acceptable, right, or could be acceptable. Then you can get away with very light types of testing, ad hoc. Right? Normally we say don't ever use that word in a regulated space, but it's actually in the guidance document. They actually use that term. They talk about you could do testing based on error guessing, right? Which is sort of like, where's the system most likely to fail,
What
right?
could go
Let's test
wrong?
that real quick, right? Yeah, right. Instead of testing the whole thing, well, if it's going to go wrong, it's going to go wrong here. Or just exploratory, we just, say, oh, here's the basic functions. Let's go see what we can find. And this is the type of testing that's often based on user experience, right? You just hand it to a user and go, play with this and document what you find, right? Try the basic functions you use every day. That's the concept of an ad hoc or exploratory
Some of
test.
us might call that monkey testing.
Okay, yeah. So that was funny when I was in the software industry earlier in my career. We used to do what we call mug testing, which was the malicious user group, where we were told we were given a piece of software we were not trained on and told to try to do everything wrong. It was a lot of fun. We'd get like pizza and we'd sit around and go, "What happens if you enter this instead of this?"
Not
Gotta do the
muggles,
workflow in the wrong
mugs,
order.
mug testing.
Yeah. So I always love that term, mug testing. So gonna mug the software. So the unscripted is kind of at that low end. At the higher end, right? If you have a higher risk system and therefore need to do full validation, then you're into the more traditional scripted testing, right? Where you're prescribing the steps, right? So the tester has to do it in this order. You tell them, here's the expected results. They have to record what were the actual results. Were there any deviations? Did they deviate? Did the system require a deviation? Right? The very traditional type of testing, similar to what you would do with your product software, right? You would do this kind of testing. It allows for that there's no problem with doing automated. Well, sorry, this is different. I got ahead of myself. You can allow for if the software has built in verification and detection features, right? So you're supposed to enter a number, an integer, and you try to enter an alphabetic character, right? And it goes, can't accept that, right? It's not going to try to process, it's just not going to let you proceed. So those count as well, going, hey, we don't have to test this because we've sort of error proofed it. And they said, yep, that counts as well. To say, yep, that's our approach based on our assessment of the risks is, certain places where we absolutely need things to be done a certain way, there won't be any other way to do it. Right? Supplier validation. So they acknowledge that, yeah, a lot of companies, offer you their validation toolkit, or they'll tell you that it comes validated, right? Which means you're getting some sort of documentation from them, which is why we have the sub-bullet saying, well, that assumes you have some risk-based supplier controls and how you've selected those vendors, and what it is they're able to provide to you. But they're saying, yeah, that could be part of your strategy as well, is to say, yep, we bought a system that comes with a validation documentation set, and so we don't have to do it. The vendor's already done it for us, and that's fine as well. And then the part I was getting ahead of myself before was automated testing is fine as well. It doesn't, they're not implying that it has to be human user based testing. If you're developing your own software and you're using, software development tools that provide for automated testing, like regression testing or something like that, that's fine too. That you can make that part of your strategy, and they'll accept that, as good rationale for how you validated the system. All right, just taking a quick look. No questions, at least not in the
No, no open
Q&A.
questions.
All right, good. All right, then if you know me, you know my favorite line. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen is the rest of that statement, right? And it's interesting, they've come back in the guidance and said, look, it's not our intent here to make you create a whole bunch of documentation. And they are clear. We're not telling you need to massively document this thing. They want you to provide, and again, one of those weasel words, sufficient documentation to demonstrate the software performs as intended. And you get to define that, right? And again, that could be scaled to each system and its risk profile. For this type of system, right, which has a low risk, then this is the documentation set that's required. For a fully validated system, that documentation set looks different. But again, you get to scale it, right, to avoid overburdening yourself. But the basics are, right? Are you able to demonstrate what the system does, why it works that way, how it works, and and what were the results of your testing? Those are kind of the basics. Some examples they give, right? You want to document the intended use. And I get that's probably something companies don't do well at. So that might be a new one, right? To say, yeah, for each system, we should have something that describes the system and what it's supposed to be used for. Where is your documentation of the risk assessment of that system? Right? How did you determine if it was, no risk, low risk, medium, whatever, scale you use? Documenting your actual strategy, right, for validating and maintaining that validated state, and then the protocols if you've got doing the scripted testing, and then of course documenting the results and any conclusions of those results. That's the basic documentation set that they're looking for. Um, and again, it'll scale according to how much risk is involved with the system and therefore how many activities are going to be involved in validating that system. But they're not saying, look, here's a standard set of documentation, and we don't care how minimal it is. You have to produce all this. They're going, no, if it's a pretty basic system, then the documentation can be pretty basic as well. All right, this one was interesting, and it was a change from the draft. Is now they are specifically there's a section on Part 11. Again, this is 21 CFR Part 11. Right? If you're not familiar with that, that's the FDA regulation on electronic records and electronic signatures. Okay? And it makes sense because basically computer software stores records electronically. That's what it does. So therefore, if you're asking the question, does Part 11 comply? The answer is yes. Okay. There is no way to answer no, that I'm using software, but I'm not maintaining electronic records, right?
And,
The
and just
signatures piece may have a yes or no answer.
Just a clarification, Steve, because often I run into people all the time that when we talk about software validation, their first reference is to Part 11. And I'm like, no, that is not the purpose of Part 11. It's electronic records and electronic signatures. Now, a big part of that would be, yes, electronic signatures, you need to validate that those are actually work in the way
Right.
that Part 11 requires them to, right? You have to actually enter a password every time that you do a signature. You don't, and the first time you enter, you have to enter, it has to have two factors, at least a username and a password, those types of things. You have to validate that that's what your system does, right? So that's a big part of this validation, but that's a requirement that's outlined in Part 11.
Right. Yep, exactly. And I think this bullet is the really important one here, right? There's no new requirements. Part 11 is what it's always been, and you should be applying it anyway. So it's not like, oh, I got a bunch of new requirements to meet here because now they want me to validate my computer software. No, it's always been there, and the requirements have not changed. Right now, it's just more, clearly aligned with the activities you're going to perform there. One of my favorite topics here is spreadsheets.
Hmm.
Okay. What about spreadsheets? Because I often get people going, what? We have to validate spreadsheets? Well, I don't know. Do we? Well, the guidance document uses the term spreadsheets 14 times. So I'm going to guess yes.
Yeah. And
Here's your
one of the
sign.
things that comes up for people, Steve, is the phrase usually is, you mean I have to validate Excel? No, that is not what we said. Okay? You can go back to the spreadsheet thing and Steve will outline some more here.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember, right? Your spreadsheets are basically another type of software, right? When you create formulas, you're essentially doing programming. If you build in macros, you're definitely doing programming, right? And that adds to the level of risk, right? If your spreadsheet, and this is why you get to do an assessment, right? If it's a spreadsheet that you use as a log, right? There are no formulas. It's a nice matrix tool to enter things in the right field, right? That's going to be the kind of thing you're going to go, nope, doesn't have any risk associated with it, other than maybe it becomes the electronic record. But then it's just how do I protect that rather than the use of it. But if I start building in some fancy formulas or I build in macros, all of a sudden you're now creating a new piece of software based on top of Excel. You don't have to, Mark said, you don't have to validate Excel, but you're going to have to validate those functions depending on the risk of what they do. Okay. So basically, your spreadsheets potentially become just another piece of software. So the same rules and approaches apply to it. It's not a different beast or a different animal.
And,
It
and
is essentially just another piece of software.
because we have a little bit of time here, Steve, I just want to again emphasize this. In other words, if you put a formula in there, you can hand calculate that the result of that, of what your entry is. Then you can just make sure that the spreadsheet comes up with the same result as what you hand calculated. You have now validated it. Magic. As long as you don't change that, then your validation is done for all time for that one. Okay, you might have to do some protections and that kind of stuff to make sure that nobody can change it. But it's as simple as that. It's just that you get the expected result. There's no special thing of validating or making sure that it gets the right answer for all formulas that somebody could put in here, but that you get the right answer for the formula that you put in there.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? If your formula is a basic additions, add these three cells together, that's really simple to validate, right? But if instead behind that is some, macro that's got 40 lines of code, that's a little
Pivot,
different,
a
right?
pivot
Type of
table, a
testing.
macro, all these other
Yeah,
things,
pivot tables would
manipulations.
be another one. It's a little more complex version of applying the basic functions, right? And again, that's why you need to evaluate the risks, right? And the risk kind of profile of the software and its functionality.
But again, validation simply means that you get the result that you expected to.
Yeah. And this last bullet is kind of what I talked to at the beginning, right? Where everybody overreacts because I have to validate every piece of, every spreadsheet every engineer's put on their desktop. And no, no, no. Right. Again, you can allow for some exclusions. And usually when I implement it, I just create some sort of really quick, here, answer these three questions. And if you can answer no to all of them, then your spreadsheet is not in scope. Right. But if you answer yes to any of them, now you're going to move into this procedure for computer systems assurance. So, but then that applies not just to spreadsheets. Again, all software, you have that ability to say, look, I can show you why this should be excluded from the need to do, these assurance activities. All right. And
I don't know if we're lulling people to sleep here, but we don't have any questions. So I'm just reminding people use that Q&A
yeah,
and
please.
ask those questions.
Yeah. Because we're down, this is it. This is the last slide here. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So recommendations from all of this. You should be doing this anyway because, right, the QMSR is coming out where you're creating SOPs related to, computer software assurance. Uh, Leverage the 1345 terminology rather than your legacy, 820 clauses, right? Because you'll end up having to change them anyway. And they're already telling you, look, we're adopting these concepts, in preparation for this, anyway. Don't forget your cloud-based systems aren't exempted from this, and your spreadsheets certainly aren't. It's usually good practice that you should maintain some sort of an inventory of all of your software and more complex spreadsheets as if they were a piece of software, right? So we know, hey, yeah, we have this system and it's owned here and it's used here. And you can, again, this could be a very simple spreadsheet to go, at least we know where everything is. Right. And I don't know how many times I sit through an audit and suddenly I realized they're using a piece of software in a department, and the IT department has no idea it's there. It's like, pretty sure you guys
Somebody,
had policy on that that said you can't do that. How
yeah,
come you didn't record that anywhere?
somebody downloaded a trial version of Jump software to do some t statistical things and sample size collection. It's
Mhm.
like, uh, that's not on the list.
Yeah. And part of that could be, right, a change in the culture is helping people understand, look, when you use any sort of, computer software, including spreadsheets, there is this process you need to jump into, right? And that's why I like, a basic triaging real quick lets them know whether or not they're bound by anything. And if not, great, but even still, like require like a quick email to IT going, hey, I've downloaded this piece of software and I've evaluated it based on the three triaging questions, and I don't think it applies. Now at least they've got a record that you did it, right?
And we recommend this to all of our clients because one of the first questions that an inspector is going to ask, or an auditor for a 1345, is going to be, where's the validation of your software in your QMS? What software do you validate? If you have that inventory list, it's an easy answer. If you don't, then you're going to go, I don't know, maybe what our PDM, what do we have? It's
Yeah,
it's much easier to answer that question if you have that ready list.
exactly. All right, next one, establish a risk assessment method, right? So what is that going to look like, right? What are those questions you're going to ask about software to gauge, and what is your scale, right? What are you going to call the different risk levels? And then, right, then what do those risk levels translate into in terms of assurance activity requirements? But remember, you got to include things like cybersecurity and data integrity. I think we mentioned, part 11 again, in a second here. But okay, you can't just say, yes, we're evaluating software for risk. How are you doing that? You do have to detail what is our methodology for doing that. And by the way, this is not, I mentioned some of the concepts of 14971. They're not telling you to apply 14971, right? If you use FMEAs as a tool, they're not telling you you need to do an FMEA on all of your software. Although they do mention that that's a possibility, right? If that's part of your strategy, that maybe for your higher risk tools, you do perform an FMEA or something equivalent. But again, you need to document, what does this methodology look like? What's our strategy look like? Again, don't forget about building in something where you assess, right? Is there a need for some sort of submission or notification, right? If that's applicable to what you're doing. Depending again on the classification of the device and the ability of that software, any changes to it to, create device risks beyond just the process risks. Yes, don't forget part 11. So that, the requirements part 11 should be, part of your strategy for doing computer software assurance. Um, so don't forget that piece. It sort of underpins everything. And again, determine the required documentation based on the risk assessment, right? The risk assessment is going to tell you what activities to perform. Those activities are going to dictate what documentation is required. So it isn't just, oh yeah, we got to generate lots and lots of documentation and records in order to show validation. You may not have to, and that's why you definitely want to leverage this guidance document. And lastly, look at the appendices. It's been changed probably in about the last, I don't know, 5, 7 years. FDA used to avoid giving any sort of examples. I think it was because they were worried then that you just follow those examples. Now they realize people couldn't figure out what to do. And if they provide examples, there's a better chance that people will actually apply the guidance correctly. And this is a really good guidance document. There are a bunch of examples there's just Appendix A is the only appendix in there, and it provides all kinds of really good examples of different type of systems and how to, evaluate them, and then what type of, validation level would be required. So take advantage of the fact that they're giving you really good examples that are pretty relevant to the types of software you're likely to be using. So with that, I will say we'll open it up to general questions here. Nope, you're muted, Mark.
Sorry. Karen Pfeiffer mentioned that there's a lot of good examples that we gave. There's a lot of good examples in the guidance document, as you just mentioned, to show some of those things that need to be validated and so forth. One of the questions that I answered, typing answers, there was a question about PLM software um, on the beginning slide that we had for validation planning, and they want to know if that's considered production, quality management system, or some sort of a third category. And I'll just kind of chime in here. One of the things that we're looking at, if you would consider it being a piece of software that you're using to answer an auditor or inspector's question, they say, I need to see this, and you're going to show them something out of a piece of software. That needs to be included. It's an electronic record first of all, but second of all, if you're showing them in the system an electronic record, you're meeting some sort of a regulatory requirement or requirement from the standard. That sounds like it needs to be validated. You need to make sure that it does what you expect it to do, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if I said
Yeah, and I
any.
would agree. Typically, PLMs and PDM systems in their entirety usually fall within scope here because of the nature of what they're intended for, right? That usually your dock control function is in there. Okay, well, dock control is part of the regulations. Usually you're managing at least your engineering bill of materials. Okay, well, that's configuration, which is part of ID, right? You're establishing part numbers and how you structure things. And so that's, part of the design of your device. Um, a lot of times now there's integrated risk management tools in there for the design risk, yep. So you keep checking all the boxes. Basically, as you look at any module within a PLM or PDM system, you can pretty much always answer, yep, that's part of, I'm doing that in response to something in the regulation or the standard. And therefore, yes, it's going to fall under uh, the scope of this guidance document.
So, Steve, we're going to put you on the spot a little bit here and ask you what are the questions you ask about the spreadsheets for.
I see that. So, yeah, yeah. So I do try to make it fairly simple, right? Because companies try to avoid this. And again, QRx focuses on a lot of smaller companies. They don't have a lot of bandwidth and resources. And I don't think you have to overthink this anyway. And I don't have it memorized, but typically when it comes to evaluating spreadsheets, couple of questions that usually come to mind is things like, um, does it use any macros? Right? To me, that's right. If you say yes, you're building in programming, as I said, right? If you're not familiar with macros, you do it with a programming language called Visual Basic. So there you are. You're doing software development now. You're in the software development. So that's usually the first question. Second question is usually along the lines of, is this going to be used by more than one person? Right? If I'm just building a spreadsheet for myself to do whatever, I probably can exclude it from this because I'm the only one. But as soon as you say, oh, I'm going to have all the other engineers use this as well, congratulations, you're now in the product business, right? You have to, it's, don't underestimate what it takes to roll out a spreadsheet to other people. It's, you suddenly learn what software companies have to figure out is how to get multiple users to understand how to use this correctly and how to build it so that it's somewhat error proofed. And then my third question gets to kind of the intended use, right? Does this spreadsheet in some way address a regulatory requirement? So usually those three questions will get you a good indication of, is this spreadsheet in scope or not?
Yeah. And typically, I mean, there's a lot of us that would say, is it being used for decision making, right? Am I going to
Yeah,
write
I've
a
used
cap
that question as well. Yeah. Yeah.
if I'm going to write a kappa or not? Am I defining, some actions or activities that are going to come from this, that'll drive those activities? If it's driving me to do something, more than likely it needs to be validated, right? Because I don't want to waste work. I want to make sure that I'm getting the right answer before I waste doing work.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Any other
Hopefully
questions?
that helps, Andrew.
Yeah, hopefully that was what you needed, Andrew. No. One thing I wanted to point out, like I said, we were, obviously given the time constraints, we're not doing a how-to here. There's a new question. We'll get that in a second. I did want to note we are actually developing a half-day workshop that is going to be more geared towards how to do this. and maybe give you some tips and tools you can use, like what should the three questions be? What should your risk assessment look like? So look for that. Hopefully around late Q1 we should have that workshop available.
Yeah, Steve, I'm gonna be interested on how you answer Karen's questions here. You know that often you do get from people, yeah, we're making decisions off of it, but there's a human in evaluating it in between here. Do I still need to validate that?
That's interesting because it kind of comes back to I'm going to go back to the regs, right? The idea of when do you have to validate a process, right? You have to validate it if it can't be verified effectively. And so I could apply the same logic here and go, well, yeah, if the software offers an opinion, we'll call it, but ultimately a person, right, a competent person is going to then make the final decision. You could say, there we go, we've got built-in verification in the process, and therefore the software isn't as risky, right? So that could lower the risk profile.
But then
Uh,
I'd ask your question about are you going to give this to somebody else and do they have the same ability to ask those questions about is it
right.
good?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think I'd lean towards that, yeah, you need to validate that.
Yeah, again, a conservative approach is usually better, right? If in doubt, go the conservative route, right? Is usually the best way to go.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of things where you have that human review, quote unquote human review, right?
Mhm.
You're actually making the decision, the software's not making the decision. Well, that's always the case, right? And so that's why I'm like, well, if it's always the case, then what, what triggers me over to validate versus not validate? Again, it talked about complexity, the need for the competence, all of that kind of stuff. If you're more relying on it than not, then to me it sounds like something that needs to be validated.
Yeah, and before we go to the next question, Karen had a follow-on to it that,
Yep.
kind of guess what we're talking about here about proving the person review. Yeah, again, you'd have to proceduralize that, right? Is to say, well, when does that occur in the process and who gets to make that decision. To Mark's point about, as you have multiple people now involved, how do you know it's the right person, the competent person to do it? So, I would say, yeah, you'd have to proceduralize that in order to point to it and go, that's why we didn't have to validate that part of the system because procedurally we've got it covered. Right? If it's not documented, didn't happen. All right, then we got a question here about validating things like RIMS or LIMS systems. Yeah, again, it's going to come down to intended use, just as you surmised there, to whoever the anonymous person is. A limb system, well, I don't think there's a whole lot of wiggle room there. Its whole intent is to generate test data, right? Which is a required record. So I think the limbs is a pretty straightforward one that you're going to always say, yes, we're going to have to validate that. Then it's, what exactly are you testing and tracking, right? Which could get it to maybe a lower risk level, maybe something more moderate. But the RIMS can be interesting. Again, that one, right? Regulatory information management systems. You're using a system to help you find applicable regs and references to predicates. Again, yeah, you have to, what are you doing with that and how are you using it? So that one does have some wiggle room in it.
And many of those systems have summary reports and that kind of stuff. And so you're going to have to make sure that those reports are actually giving you the answer you expect. I mean, again, if you're using those systems and relying on them, wouldn't you want to know that it actually works? Most companies that offer these software packages will provide you with that, right? I mean, that should be a question you might ask to them and say, "Hey, do you have validation information with this software?"
Yeah, especially now we have a lot more AI, right, based tools. Companies that are offering things that go, hey, that annual literature search you have to do. We have a tool now that'll describe your device and it'll go find all the right stuff. You'd want to ask, how did you train this? Right? What sources is it picking from? How do you know that those are valid sources? How do you know they're up to date? Right? Those kind of things. So, again, I think it gets a little trickier with all the AI based tools. but you've got to ask the right questions, which is why in the slide earlier I said it assumes you've got the right degree of risk-based supplier controls in place, is to know what questions do I need to ask of the supplier rather than just be enamored with, oh, look, it says that it comes pre-validated. Check, we're good. Wait, what does that mean? Yeah. So again, somebody said, yeah, usually typically that validation package includes the IQ and OQ, but not the PQ. Yeah, I always sort of bristle when I see companies say that. I've seen companies advertise, oh no, we've got it all, IQ, OQ, and PQ. And I kind of go, how could they pre-do the pre-PQ? Because that's based on your actual usage of it. So I get it. Thank you for doing the IQ and the OQ or giving me a way to automate that and maybe a toolkit to help me do the PQ, but there's no way that they could tell you in advance that the PQ is done unless it's some sort of, again, cloud-based system and they're dictating the use of the software, the workflows, and there's no other way to use it other than the way they're telling you to use it, then maybe I suppose you could do it. But to me, it still kind of flies in the face of the point of PQ, which is actual usage.
Great.
All right, so where are we at here? 4 minutes. Any final questions? Thoughts? All right. No, looks like we've stumped them, Mark.
Yeah. Or we've perfectly answered everything that could come up, right?
We figured out ahead exactly what you guys wanted to know. So now we hope this has been useful. We again appreciate the good turnout for this one. And you're spending, for some of you, your lunchtime with us. And again, you can reach out, Mark and I, it was on the earlier slides, our direct emails and contacts. If you want to talk to our company, there's an email address here. You can connect with us on LinkedIn. If you think of something a couple of days from now or something comes up at work, you go, oh, I bet these guys can answer that. We're happy to answer those kind of questions. So please
And
reach out to us.
and I tell people all the time, you can go to our website, the QRxPartners.com. Steve and I's picture on is obviously on that first page. If you click on our picture, you get our direct email. So feel free to send us a note. Connect to us on LinkedIn if we're not already connected. And we look forward to getting your questions and helping everybody out.
Yeah, and don't forget to follow QRX on LinkedIn, and then you'll find out when we have that workshop of it, as well as other things. All
Thank,
right. Thank you, everybody.
yep, thank you.
Have
Bye.
a good day and good weekend.